like you switch web pages here, and then like when you go from a black screen to a white screen, and it's so bright. Now my screen is super bright, so just bear with me for a moment while I refresh page, please. Okay, there you go. Just putting my notifications on social media. Just give me a second here. Starting a little bit late, so we're going to dive into it pretty quickly. Wow, that's a really bad thumbnail. Anyway, I'm not too worried about it. Put that away. Okay. Already starting late, so let's get started, shall we? Hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Reads the Book of Exodus, and today, well, today is it's hard to act excited. No, that's not a good way of wording it. I don't like wording it that way, but like, how do I put it? I'm reading a part of the Bible that most people probably skip over. I mean, why lie about it, right? Because, I mean, this is the part where God just gives Moses a whole bunch of commands and laws, right? The edicts to give to the people of Israel. And boy howdy, right? Like there's a lot. First of all, there's a lot of content. So, you know, if you were just casually reading the Bible, you're like, oh my goodness, there's just so much here, right? Like I don't know if I want to read through all this, right? And then of course, you know, it's not like an exciting narrative, right? Like I mean, we did just read like, you know, the last set of chapters ago, you know, Israel leaves Egypt and they go fight, you know, the Amalekites, right? So awesome stuff has been happening, and then like the Bible kind of takes this kind of slower pace, right? Now we're not in this high action part, but now it's all talk, right? I mean, you think of like, if you were to think of like an anime or something to like parallel, it's like, okay, now we're in those like kind of drama episodes of My Hero Academia, right? Or like, you know, we're not in the action episodes. We're in the drama episodes, and that's kind of where we are at in today's reading of Exodus. So I'm gonna reread the Ten Commandments in chapter 20, because when I watched the playback, I'm like, man, I did not do this chapter justice. I mean, to be fair, I mean, chapter 20 could be a stream on its own, but we're not gonna do that. But I am gonna reread it and then kind of go over stuff I didn't cover last time. And of course, repeat some things I did say last time, so there's that. And then we'll continue on with other laws that God gives to Moses. If you guys want to follow along, I will be reading from the New International Version. Just, you know, BibleGateway.com, Bible app, right? It's free. Why not use it? No reason not to, right? But anyway, I'm just going to start us off with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll just dive right into the text, because we do have a lot of ground to cover, assuming we're going to try and get through all this, you know, all the edicts early. Or not early, but like, you know, as fast as we can, which, I mean, that's asking a lot, honestly. Anyway, let's just start with a quick word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read into your word. And I just pray that as we read your word, that we would, especially with the edicts that you give to Moses, that you would show us, you know, your plans and your desires, and um, your ambitions even for our lives and how we ought to live, and how not just to serve you, but to serve one another. And I pray that these words would really mark us in our hearts to be able to do that. I just pray this in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. Alrighty. We got so much content, so that's why I'm kind of like, let's just get right into it, right? So here we go. I'm going to reread the Ten Commandments, which is chapter 20. But before that, I'm just going to give a quick preface. My hot take from last week, so it doesn't count as the hot take for this week, right? Is where God takes on a more frightening form when he appears on Mount Sinai, which is where chapter 19 kind of has this interesting scene, right? Where God appears on Mount Sinai, in the black cloud with the trumpet and the lightning and the thunder and stuff like that, and a fire, right? And this is supposed to be similar to when he struck the firstborn of Egypt, where, my hot take in regard to that reading was, God kind of acts like a grim reaper, as odd as that sounds. But, the before people start, calling me out for like heresy of like, oh, the God of the Bible also being like the harbinger of death. But like, I mean, there's the whole Sodom and Gomorrah thing. But the extension of logic that I use, and I'll repeat it again, is, you know, if God is the source of all life, right, and God decides who lives because he is the one who gives all life, then by extension, he can also take away life, right? This is what Job is talking about in the book of Job, especially in the beginning, Job 1:21, the Lord give and he takes, right? And so, I mean, Job understood this idea. And so, I mean, it's in the Bible, so I guess it's a legitimate thing to think. So, but because God is the giver of life, he is also the one who can take it, which is exactly what he does to Egypt. And he kind of takes on this grim reaper form when he does so. And the weird part when you get to chapter 19 is that he still appears this way to Israel, right? He doesn't appear, in the more priestly, sacrificial element that we see in like the burning bush, right? Instead, he still appears in this more terrifying way, which, to be fair, is exactly why Israel was like, the people of Israel were like, oh, heck no, right? We're not going near that. And of course, on top of that, God even gives commands to Moses to say, hey, no one can touch the mountain until I say so, or else that person will die, right? And I mean, when you think of all that, I mean, it makes complete sense why God would say that, right? Because he's like, I am in my terrifying form, right? And so I bring this up, and why it's relevant is because we get to chapter 20, and it's where the begins of the Ten Commandments. And as I mentioned last week, it's kind of meant to say that, like, God, the statement God is making, I guess you could say, is that, you know, these laws and edicts that God is going to give, like, they are so important that, like, if they are broken, the Reaper comes for you more or less, right? Because I mean, this is where the rest of the Bible always talks about, the the consequence of sin is death, right? And of course, Paul words it as straightforward as that in the book of Romans, right? The wages of sin is death. And so God is very, very serious about his commandments. Now, this is obviously another thing that's really important, that a lot of modern Bible commentators critique modern Christianity, modern evangelicalism, is that the reason why, now you're ready for the hot take of the week. Um, the reason why a lot of churches are in decline is because many Christians are too wishy-washy. And in the statement that's made by modern Bible commentators is that most people don't think the Bible as being a binding is the word, right? Like, if I am to be a Christian, then the stuff in the Bible should be binding, in that I should live up And I should actually pay attention to the stuff the Bible actually says. And many commentators would say that, like, well, that's probably the reason why many modern evangelicalism is so bad, is because a lot of Christians don't have that attitude towards the Bible. The Bible's kind of secondary, right? And of course, we run into this whole problem of, like, most people kind of base their faith on their feelings, but of course, the Bible does tell you, your feelings are unreliable. You can't really trust them, especially when it comes to making judgment about truth, right? You can't really trust your feelings because your feelings are, well, all over the place, right? Now, in a vacuum, that's not a bad thing. Your feelings should be all over the place. But I wouldn't, but what the Bible is saying is, because that's true, you can't rely on your feelings, right? And that's why we need, God's authority, for instance, right? Because, well, our feelings are unreliable, right? In a vacuum, that's not a bad thing. But I wouldn't put a much stock in feelings for how I should live my life, right? Which is where the laws kind of come in, right? And the laws is kind of one of the earliest documents that's kind of meant to help people, how to live as an individual and as a society, because you can't rely on your feelings to do that. Because, I mean, we just read in the early parts of Exodus, I mean, most people's feelings would kind of go with the strong subjugate the weak, like how the Egyptians put the Hebrews into slavery. That feels right, but is it right? And obviously the answer is no, right? So with that said, now let's go back to this whole, God appears in the black cloud, right? And he's saying that, like, look, these edicts I'm going to give you, they're extremely important, and you got to live by them. Of course, we know that it is impossible to do ourselves, and that's why we need, all the more reason you need Jesus. But at the same time, we are still to look at these laws as if they really mattered, right? Because, the foundation of Christianity is that, well, since Christ rose from the dead, then these things do matter, right? Even if we cannot do them perfectly, we still got, you have an obligation to try, right? It's actually your moral imperative to try, even if you fail, right? That's kind of what the Bible also gets at. You have a moral imperative to try, and God doesn't care as that much if you fail, which is the funny thing. Is that God doesn't care all that much that you fail, because he knows that we are weak. But at the same time, to not pay attention to his law, that would be the real crime, right? But of course, in Christianity, we also believe that through the resurrection power of Jesus, we are empowered to be able to do. We are empowered, to be able. Sorry, my phone was just going bonkers there for a second. We are empowered to be able to live out the commands. Once again, not perfectly, because remember, we're just people, right? It is only through the person of Jesus that the law can actually be fulfilled. But I mean, we're going to kind of not really talk about that right now, because let's look at Exodus's how God gives the command in Exodus within the context of how Moses and the Israelites are supposed to prepare to move into Canaan, which is another important thing, that the laws are, designed the way they are. And I will obviously give a much heavier commentary on, okay, what does this law actually mean? And, why does it matter to the Israelites, 3,000 years ago and whatever. So that's my long preface to talking about the books of the law. Okay, now that we're finally here. Exodus 20. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Now you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. For on it you shall not do any work, neither you, your son or daughter, your male or female slaves, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land that your Lord God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, nor covet your neighbor's wife, or his male and female servant, his ox, donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now when the people saw the thunder and the lightning, and heard the trumpet, and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear, and they stayed at a distance. And they said to Moses, "Speak for us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning." The people remained at a distance, while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites this. You have seen for yourselves that I have spoken to you from heaven. Do not make any gods to be alongside me, and do not make for yourselves gods of silver or gods of gold. Make an altar of earth for me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Your sheep, wow. Sheeps is not a real word, by the way. Sheep, plural for sheep is sheep. Your sheep and goats and your cattle. Wherever I cause my name to be honored, I will come to you and I will bless you. If you make an altar of stones for me, do not build it with dressed stones, for you will defile it if you use a tool on it. And do not go up to my altar on steps, or your private parts may be exposed." Odd way to end chapter 20, but okay. So, chapter 20, the 10 Commandments. Now, I did do a huge thing on the 10 Commandments last week, so I'll kind of just briefly review and add other notes that I didn't talk about last time. So, the first thing is that the beginning of the chapter specifically says that, God said all these things. Now, this is important because the idea of a objective morality, right? Even if you're not a Christian, even if you don't believe in God, right? The idea of an objective morality has to supersede human intellect. That's kind of the idea that's given here, right? So God said these things. Because here's the thing about laws and commandments, and this is where a lot of people think laws change over time, and to an extent that's true. But when it comes to fundamental things like the 10 Commandments, which an interesting thing about the 10 Commandments is that, they are the foundations of how you can run a society, right? And that's the macrocosm, right? You can think of a Discord community, or the poker club, that meets at the Italian Center down the street or something, right? It's a community that needs a set of rules and laws for that community to exist, right? Because if there aren't rules, then the place will just be chaos, right? and then you won't really have a community, and by extension, on a large scale, a society. And so the Ten Commandments are kind of meant to operate not just like how we should live as individuals toward God, which is obviously true, but at the same time, the Ten Commandments are also foundational to how to run a society, which is why the 10 are picked the way they are. But when the Ten Commandments starts with, well, God said these things, right? It gives the idea that like these fundamental rules for us to follow, they don't exist on a human intellectual level. And the reason for that is because, well, let's put it this way. If a human were to set up rules, then another human could just say, well, that works for you. Why do I have to follow that, right? And so, and you see this all the time today, right? Where you may tell someone, you know, oh, it's wrong to do this, or I don't like it when you do that. And someone could just say, well, you don't tell me what to do, right? So if, let's say, Moses came up with these rules, people could just be, well, who is this Moses and why should I listen to him, right? Or if it was a king, it's like, well, who is this king? Why should I listen to him? Or even if a government set up rules, well, who is this government and why should I have to listen to him, right? And that's an easy objection that we can make. But God, whoever God may be, right? The idea is that, well, God says it, and therefore it cannot be challenged by us on our human intellectual level, because, I mean, God transcends humanity, and so God is a higher level of authority that we cannot simply say, well, I don't have to do what you say, right? Because that won't work for you, right? And I mean, in a similar way, I mean, we kind of treat the government in a similar fashion, right? When the government sets up certain laws, you don't get to just say, well, I don't have to pay taxes. You may make it a law, but it's your man-made law. Why should I have to pay taxes, right? That's a ridiculous idea, by the way. That's not going to get you very far, right? If you actually tried that, right? I don't recommend you try it, right? Your government's going to be, you know, sending police with warrants and stuff. But and that's gonna go down real badly. But anyway, the idea that a transcendent being gives us laws, it makes the laws themselves have a transcendent nature. And this also makes sense when you look cross-culturally, right? Like, for example, do not steal is a law that works regardless of the culture you're in, right? So obviously there's a transcendent nature to the command of do not steal, right? Or do not murder. Imagine a society that could try and function if murder was allowed, right? People would just be killing each other left and right just because someone pissed you off enough, right? But obviously your society wouldn't last, right? If people could just do that, right? So obviously these laws have a nature to them that is beyond, you know, our human individual lives, right? And they affect something much larger than ourselves. A simple example is your local community, or, you know, your society in a nutshell, right? That's how society can sustain itself, right? If you don't have these kind of laws that transcend, you know, human feelings and thoughts, then you don't have a society. Society would, you know, would collapse pretty quickly, right? And logically so, right? Like, it doesn't take a whole lot of brain cells to figure that out. So, with that said, though, what the Bible's getting at here is that since God is, you know, it is from the person of God, the same guy, you know, who puts on a Grim Reaper outfit and kills the firstborn of Egypt, the same guy, which can be a little disorienting when you have that image in your head, right? And so many people would then make the claim that, well, maybe is God trying to use the law as like a fear tactic, right? And that's a legitimate thing to ask, right? I'm not opposed to people asking that question, but when you go through the commandments themselves, then you actually see something far more sublime and an interesting twist on the nature of God. That, I mean, on the one hand, they're meant to be a given because, God is love, God is good, and all those things. So, the laws kind of remind you of that. But at the same time, there's this interesting imagery that needs to be associated with the person of God. And we're going to kind of delve into that. I already talked a fair amount about it last week, so review last week's stream, the second half of it, where I talk about this chapter in a lot more detail. But I'm going to do some spark notes on each commandment. So we're going to do this part pretty quickly. First commandment, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery. That's actually the first command because it's the first thing he says. So why does God pick this thing of all things to talk about, right? Of all things, God could have said, well, I am the God who created the universe. And that's a good enough reason to worship me, right? And to be fair, that would be a good enough reason. But instead, God identifies himself with how he relates to humans, which is an interesting thing, right? God puts stock on how he relates to other people, not on just who he is, right? Because once again, he could have just done that. He could have just been like, well, I'm the God who made the universe, right? Good enough reason. But instead, he talks about how he delivered Israel from the land of slavery, out of the land of bondage. And this is important because it reminds people that, like, oh yeah, like, sure, God is super scary, and he is. I mean, he shows up in a black in a black cloud with lightning, right? Not something that people be like, oh yeah, totally chill, just walk up to them. Like, no, right? And so, despite this scary nature, God is saying that I am the one who delivered you out of, the hellish world of slavery. And so, that's how God identifies himself in this passage, right? And so he, by extension, is taught. He's basically saying that I am your friend. I'm not someone to be feared, right? Because if you think of it this way, if he had done the creation statement and say, well, I'm the God who made the universe, so you should listen up, right? The parallel I used last week, and I'll use it again, is Dr. Frankenstein, right? And this motif that's used in like all kinds of science fiction and fantasy, because I mean it's a very important moral lesson of bad things happen when people try to act like God. And so Dr. Frankenstein, he says the line that nobody should ever say, but it's used a lot. And it's the, I created you and I can uncreate you. Or I made you and I can unmake you, right? And usually that never works out for them, right? Because their creation ends up, betraying them, and rightfully so. Which is a major part of the story of Frankenstein. A book everybody should read. But that's just my opinion. But anyway, in a very different sense, God doesn't do that. He doesn't use that kind of statement because that's not a good way of how to approach people. You don't tell them, I made you and I can unmake you, right? Instead, God is saying, despite how terrifying I am your friend. And that is, in a funny way, that's a very cordial thing for God to do, right? He doesn't have, because God doesn't have to do that, right? He could force us, to do what he says. I mean, it's not outside of his power, but he doesn't do it that way, right? God gives us freedom to decide for ourselves. And so he addresses us as his friend, which is what he's doing in the first commandment. I am the Lord your God who delivered you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So he is your friend that desires your freedom. As opposed to, I created you and I can uncreate you. So that's the first commandment in a nutshell. Which then leads up to the second commandment of, do not have other gods before him, right? You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make. And then he continues the commandment, where many people wrongly think these are two separate commandments, but they're not. Verse 3 and 4 are actually all one command. Or rather, verse 3 to verse 6. It's actually all one command, and verse 4 to verse 6 is an explanation of verse 3, where he says, well, you shall have no other gods. And then he labels like nature gods, right? Like, don't worship things in the heavens above, earth beneath, or the waters below. Don't make don't build images for yourself. Do not bow to them, and do not make gods out of like gold and silver or whatever, right? And stuff like that. So, in contrast to the first command, which is why many people get them mixed up, right? But in contrast, God is saying that, like, well, I will never threaten you by, I made you and I can unmake you. So don't treat me and don't put like these kind of nature gods on the same, like, don't think of us as the same, right? Because a nature god basically does that, right? Because you think of like how the ancient world worked, right? And you think of like how people viewed nature gods, right? We owe our lives to the nature gods because, oh, we're at their mercy at all times, right? Because a nature god just send a storm and kill us, or a nature god could dry out the river or whatever, right? And then we would die, right? Stuff like that. That kind of logic, which is, that made sense in the ancient world, right? That's how people used to think. But God is saying, like, I'm not like that, right? I'm not going to hold your life ransom like that, right? I I will not threaten your existence like that. Dr. Frankenstein all over again, right? Which is why God is so adamant about, don't worship, other gods, right? Because usually that's how the other, if you look at other mythologies, you actually do see this as a bit of a pattern, right? That's how they behave, right? They kind of act like they can do whatever they want. And I mean, to be fair, that's, if you were to, the basic definition of a god, right, would be, these far more than human beings, and so they would have every right to do that, right? You think of like Greek mythology as a simple place to look at that, right? Like the gods just do whatever they want, and it causes all kinds of havoc on the world. And everyone makes jokes about like how petty Athena is a good example, right? So Athena, uh, the goddess of war in Greek mythology, she's like super petty. So like whenever there's like a mortal that thinks they can do stuff like the gods, like there was one woman who thought she was as attractive as a god. There was one woman who thought she was as good like a weaver as the gods, and which is like never a good idea, right? That kind of pride. And then Athena usually punishes them by turning them into monsters. And then of course down the line, those same monsters terrorize humans for generations, right? So Arachne is a good example of this. So Arachne is one of those characters that like she thought she could weave better than the gods, and Athena was not having it. So Athena turns her to a giant spider, basically. And then this giant spider terrorizes this one town, and then I can't remember which Greek hero is it that has to go put her down, right? But when you look at the large scale of the narrative, it's like, well, the Greek gods just do whatever they want, and they have no regard for humans, right? If there's a monster that's made that terrorizes people, well, the gods are just like, oh, whatever. The humans will figure it out how to get themselves out of it, right? Which is a really terrible way of doing things, especially if you're supposed to be, the rulers of your dimension, right? It's a terrible way of doing things, right? But in the Bible, God is not like this, right? He's basically saying that, like, look, man, like, I'm not going to do that. So that's the more reason you don't worship these other gods, right? Because why would you want to worship these asshats? Basically, is what God is getting at. I mean, he wouldn't use those kind of words, but you get the idea, right? Continuing on to command 3, you shall not misuse the name of God. Often misinterpreted for people that think it means like swearing, especially when they're like, they're like Jesus Christ, right? Whenever they're frustrated or something, right? Which, yeah, you shouldn't say those things because, you shouldn't take a holy name of God and use it, like equate it to excrement. But with that being said, that is not what this passage is talking about when it says you shall not misuse the name of God. What this passage is actually saying is when you behave, when you perform an action, you should always represent yourself. And if you are an ambassador of God, say like the priest or something, or typically a pastor is a good example, right? Then you ought to conduct yourself well, right? Because before God gives the rest of these commandments, there's a very important underline that God is making with this commandment and why it's number 3 on the list. Because as we go down to from 4 to 10, it's all about morality, right? And so God is trying to make a statement about how he is the source of morality, right? And so, what does misusing the name of God have to do with that? Well, if you misrepresent God in regards to morality, you've done irreparable damage to how people view God and morality, being hand in hand, right? Because God is trying to give the idea that he is the source of morality. But if people, especially because of for example, a Christian's actions, and then people think, well, I can't equate God with morality, right? Well, that is the worst thing to happen. And unfortunately, we see that in the world today, right? That's why there's a lot of antagonism towards Christianity because of some bad actions done in the past. At the same time, it can't be helped, right? Because people are people, and people are crap. But at the same time, when people were like, well, we are representing Jesus Christ, and then they commit atrocities, right? And it's not even it's not Christians alone that do this, right? Why there's a lot of pushback against Muslims nowadays, right? Same idea, right? Well, 9/11, right? And it was a religious attack and all that stuff, right? And um, when you equate violence with your God, right? Even though you're trying to proclaim that your religion is of peace, well, you got a problem there, right? And that's misusing the name of God, that kind of thing. And so the Bible is getting this idea that look, I want you guys to represent me when you go into the new land, okay? To the land of Canaan. I want you guys to represent me and be able to tell people about me and evangelize and all that stuff, right? I'm sure I'm using modern Christian language, but you get the point. God's telling the Israelites, you're supposed to represent me, all right? Which means you cannot make me look bad. Completely logical. God wants the world to know that he is about morality. But that cannot happen if you're misrepresented, especially in a very negative way, right? And so that's what the third commandment actually means. Moving on, the Sabbath day is a very odd command. It talks about how, we should take rest. But I think an easy context is to look at the first command, God freeing Israel from slavery. And of course, in the book of Deuteronomy, when this commandment comes up again, the Sabbath command, the command is actually extended and talks about how God specifies, well, you were once slaves in Egypt, right? And so the idea was slaves don't get a holiday. Slaves don't get a day off, right? I mean, if you're a slave, you're completely subject to your slave owner's will. If he wants you to work 8 days a week, you work 8 days a week, right? And so that is the life of a slave. But free people get a day off. Heck, they should get multiple days off, right? In a week. Free people get to do that. Slaves don't. And so the Sabbath was a reminder that Israel was to be a free people. And also to treat other people as if they were free people, right? Even the foreigners among them, which is specified in the law, right? Even your male and female slaves, your animals, and the foreigner among you, you shall all have a Sabbath, right? Or, well, back in the Jewish world, they had the Sabbath day, which was Saturday. And so the idea here is that you're a free people, so act like it. And that's the real point of the Sabbath. Moving on to commandment number 5, honor your father and mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord is going to give you. Now, the interesting take I took on last week, and I'll kind of re-emphasize it, is the idea that your parents get special treatment. And I did not mention this last time, but the Bible actually doesn't tell you to honor a lot of people. Sure, you're supposed to love God, love your enemies, love the stranger, right? But that's not the same as honoring them, which is weird that God never specifies to honor him. That's a later Christian doctrine. That, of course, the logic that the Bible uses is that God is often described as a parent, right? And God actually takes attributes of both parents. He is a father and he is a mother. And so the Christian logic that was used in the New Testament was, since God is akin to a parent, that's the word I was thinking of. God is akin to a parent, therefore God gets the honor like a parent does. Which makes logical sense, and that's why Christianity has kept that idea. Even though the Bible does not actually specifically say that, like honor God, the Bible never actually really says that. Now, don't get it confused with like when people honor God, right? Now, there's a difference, because what I'm getting at is God never commands it, but people do it in the Bible. And once again, it's the internal logic of the Bible. That since God is akin to a parent, and God even uses metaphors of being a parent, therefore, oh yeah, then we should honor God like we do a parent, right? That's the internal logic that the Bible has. But when God tells you to honor somebody, he tells you to honor your father and your mother. Now, the main reason, there's actually a couple reasons for this. There's a theological reason, if you will, and there's the societal reason, right? So the theological reason that I gave last week, my kind of hot take, but it's not really a hot take if you think about it hard enough, is the idea that your parents are supposed to be your first contact with God. Now, what the heck do I mean by that? Well, the idea is that most people get a grasp of the idea of God. You know, you think of like little kids, right? Mainly little kids. And their idea of like the idea of God, right? Where does it come from? It comes from their parents and how children view their parents. Now, unfortunately, in, you know, the 20th and 21st century, we've had a major decline in the nuclear family. Well, not just the nuclear family, but on family values in general. And, you know, unfortunately, we have a huge, you know, it's almost like an epidemic, actually, of like single parent families, especially when, like, you know, the kids' biological fathers walk out because they're asshats, right? Guys that just think with their dicks. And so, you know, a lot of these kind of things happen, and it's a real problem that this has happened as much as it has, because, you know, now you have like all these women that are super bitter towards men, and rightfully so. And then of course you have all these children that are just like extremely bitter towards society because, you know, this society of high pressure allowed guys like this to exist. So now you have all these children that hate society because they're projecting their terrible fathers onto it. And once again, rightfully so. There's a good reason for it. And so when the Bible talks about honor your father and mother, and that both of them are there, because good parenting would give children a better view of God, whereas bad parenting doesn't, right? And so this is more anecdotal, and, you know, take this bit with a grain of salt, but, you know, I know people, and when I talk to people about, like, you know, why they have certain views on God or whatever, and as like a counselor, well, pastors do some counseling, so I'm not like a counselor, but, you know, as a pastor, you know, you act like a counselor, right? You're a free counselor in a sense, but because no one has to pay you for it. But anyway, I hear stories about how, like, you know, some of these people have like really terrible upbringings, right? You know, a lot of guys I know, they have like they didn't have a father growing up, and it's no duh that they have a negative view towards God, right? They think of like, well, my father was an absent father, and so their view of God was like, well, he doesn't exist. He's not real. And even if he was, he clearly doesn't care about me or whatever, right? And people have this idea because they easily associate with the people that should be the closest in their lives, and if there's a negative impact, that's easily projected onto God. And even though it's not right to do that exactly, I understand why people do that, and it's completely logical to do that, right? Of course, the flip can also be said, and I know some people are critical about Christians this way, but like let's say I grew up with two awesome parents, right? My parents are awesome, right? And so I have a very positive view also on God, right? When I was growing up, I had a very positive view of God when I was growing up because my parents were like pretty kick-ass. My parents were awesome, and so you could make the argument that like, well, that makes me more likely to be a believer when I became one when I, in my teenage to late teen years, right? When I became a Christian, I had a very positive view because my parents were a very good example, right? And I had a very positive view of like, well, if God is akin to a parent, the biblical logic thing. If God is akin to a parent, and my parents were awesome, then clearly God must be pretty cool too, right? That's kind of a subconscious logic that I had. And anyone who claims that, oh no, I didn't think that, you're kind of fooling yourselves, right? But at the same time, yes, it's not a one-to-one kind of thing, but at the same time, God acknowledges this logic, which is why he gives the command of honor your parents, right? Because your parents are supposed to be your first contact with God. And ideally, unfortunately, we don't see it very often, is that, godly parents create godly children, and God-fearing parents create God-fearing children. And so the logic here is that because your parents have done that for you, ideally, once again, not always true, unfortunately, but the logic that's given in the Ten Commandments is that since your parents were a big influencer on your view of God, you should honor and respect that, right? Of course, there's a caveat to that like, yes, there are some parents that are so awful, you don't have to honor them. And of course, the caveat is kind of an extreme caveat, right? Like a walkout dad, a dad who was never around, right? Because he walked out on your mom when she was pregnant with you. He does not deserve your respect or honor, right? Because, I mean, is he a father really, right? At that point. And of course, there's the whole thing like, there's a difference between like a parent who's like a bad parent, like abusive, right? I mean, that would give people the impression that God is abusive, and that's misusing the name of God, right? So if there's an abusive parent that gives you the idea that, well, God is also abusive, and by extension violates the third commandment, because now you're not equating God with morality. I've met a lot of people like this as well. That's an exception to the rule, right? But there's a difference between that and like an annoying parent, right? Like, my parents are naggy, despite the fact that they're awesome. But like, Michael, when are you gonna get married, right? Yeah, my parents are annoying, but like, that's not a reason to not honor them, right? And by definition, all parents are annoying, right? So, because they're parents, they're worry words. That's what they do. Parents want to see their kids be healthy and fine, so they're gonna worry about you all the time, right? That's different. I'm not saying a parent that's annoying in that way, but the exception to the honor your father and mother are parents that violate, they misuse the name of God, right, by being abusive, or, you know, walkout dads, right? If you can even call him a dad at that point, right? That's an exception to the rule because they violated a commandment that's above on the list. And yes, there is a tier system in how the Ten Commandments are laid out. Obviously, the first ones, about who God is, are obviously the most important. And then as we go down to how we should treat each other, right, are kind of less important than the worship God ones, obviously. But at the same time, there's other logic things that we have to sort through as we go through the Ten Commandments and as we analyze other laws, in the Bible. So that's why honor your father and mother is so important, right? Because they're your first contact with God, and we should be respectful of that. Even if your parent did a half decent job, right? Like, no parent is perfect, right? But as long as they're not abusive, you know, or walkout dads or walkout moms even, because those exist too. But you know, they're not any of these walkouts that they're not really your parents at that point, um, and they don't deserve your honor or respect. But minus those extreme cases, like, yeah, you know, your parents are meant to be your first contact with God, right? And I mean, to be fair, your parents are, without as much religio babble, you know, your parents are where you learn a lot of your morality from, right? And so parents that teach good morals usually bring up better kids. That's just a documented fact. And so God is saying you should honor and respect that, right? To your earthly parents, because they're doing their damnedest best. So you should respect and honor that. And so your parents get special treatment. Now, what the heck does that mean, right? Well, I mean, we kind of do it subconsciously, right? Um, First of all, you don't. Well, depending on who you don't use like expletives on your parents, right? Like sometimes you don't want to on camera. I will use expletives because I mean, in a way, you're all strangers to me. So I may use expletives even on stream, which is like, oh, hashtag terrible pastor. What kind of pastor uses expletives? But like, you know, when I'm talking to my friends, sometimes like, you know, I'll slip up on an expletive, right? Because whatever, right? I'm just telling my friends. But I don't do that with my parents. Like I'm very conscious about stuff like that with my parents and how I talk. You know, stuff like that. You know, the way you speak to your parents, you always speak with a higher level of respect, right? You don't just drop to your colloquial, you know, whatever talk, right? Because I mean, you want to show that you respect your parents by actually, you know, not acting like they're just anyone else, right? And of course, the other thing is that, like, you know, you always keep contact with your parents, right? You always make sure you're checking to see they're okay and stuff like that, right? Because put it this way, if your parents take care of you growing up, then you know that, like, well, I know they're going to be weaker when they get old, so I should be ready to take care of them. And the other thing too is, of course, like, you know, another example of like your parents being, you know, good influences on your morality. And you know, this just came to mind, kind of thing, where like when my grandfather was sick, right? Well, he wasn't sick. That's not a good way of wording it. My grandfather, he, well, basically his body was starting to break down, so he was more than just sick. But I mean, he was like 80 something when this started, and he had to go to hemodialysis for like a couple of years before he died. This was almost a decade ago. It's so weird to think that's how long it's been. But when he had to go to the hospital like every few days, he had to go like 3 times a week or something like that. He had to go like Tuesday, Thursday, Saturdays or something like that. Anyway, besides the point. So he had to go to the hospital every few days, right? And one of the things that I used to be actually like pissed off, especially to like my cousins on that part of the family, was that like every night to pick the guy up, to pick my grandfather up like 3 times a week, it was always my parents that had to do it, right? No one else could be bothered to do it. And so my parents had to go to the hospital, had to go pick him up, and then have to drive him to his house, right? And the funny thing was, and this makes it sound like mega douche, and a reason why I kind of like, there was a little bit like bitterness towards like some of my relatives. Like, no, I wasn't the only one who felt this. Like my sister and my younger brother, we felt this toward our cousins because we felt like we did a lot more than they did. But like some of my relatives were living with my grandfather, and they would not be the ones to pick him up because that would save like gas money for starters. It's less trips, right, to take him to and fro. And the funniest part was that my relatives that were living with my grandfather, you know, there were more of them because they were like, well, before, you know, they got older and got married. And the funny thing was that, like, you know, they're all older than me. So even 10 years ago, like 10 years ago, I was in my early 20s. Wow, I'm saying that out loud made me feel super old. But anyway, um, you know, like like I had a bunch of cousins that all drove. They all like drove their own cars and whatever, and they couldn't be bothered to do it. Instead, it was up to my parents, and the occasional, like, my sister, my brother, and I would have to help our parents, right? And we had to take our grandfather home to his house, every Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, right? And this reminded me that, like, how you know dutiful, and like let's just say my parents honored him, right? My dad honored him as his father-in-law, and my mom obviously honored her dad. Another reason why I think my parents are awesome, right? And then, of course, as I had seen them, take care of him in his old age, and him being grumpy because he's an old grumpy man at that point. I still think about it to this day, about, like, and I'm pretty much, like, convinced, where it's like, yeah, when that's gonna happen to my parents, hopefully it's not that bad, right? They don't have to do hemodialysis like 3 times a week, because lordy, that would suck. But if they had to do stuff like, when they're old and weak like that, right? Hopefully not as bad, but you get the point, right? Then I am prepared to take care of them, right? And my sister and my brother think the same, right? We are prepared to take care of our parents. And so, because we had seen them do it. And it really struck me when um, I was at another cousin's house on my dad's side of the family. So my grandfather, who was in the hospital, he was on my mom's side. So now we're talking about relatives on my dad's side of the family. And we were just talking about stuff. And I don't know why we were talking about, like, oh, it was because, like, maybe I think my cousin, we were going to do like a game night on like a Saturday or something like that. So I can't do that because I got to take care of my grandfather and all that. And we were talking about that a little bit. And then my uncle, my dad's brother, was like, your grandfather's lucky to have your dad as, like, a son-in-law. Like, your grandfather is amazingly blessed to have your dad as, like, a son-in-law. And for him to just say that, well, my uncle's a pretty crude guy. Sometimes he just says what's on his mind and doesn't give a rat's ass about what other people think. But he was just like, he was just blunt about that. He's like, yeah, and with that being said, my uncle being a pretty crass guy at times, he holds my dad to a very high esteem, right? He thinks the world of my dad, not just because they're brothers, but because of the kind of guy my dad is, and the person I hope to be, right? In a lot of ways, not in everything, of course. I hope I have better memory and attention span than he does, but that's besides the point. Um, but part of that is just because he's old. My parents are getting up there in years, but to be fair, I'm getting up there in years, so who am I to talk? But sorry, I just noticed a spider on my wall, and I'm gonna have to take care of it after the stream. It's not doing anything right now, but I know I'm gonna have to take care of it because it kind of bothers me that it's there, and now I can't stop thinking about it. But anyway, going back to what does this have to do with the Bible? Well, I mean, all the more reason of why this commandment is so important, right? And the other thing about this commandment, to honor your father and mother, is that this commandment gives you a reason, right? That you may live long in the days, in where God will send you, or whatever. How's it worded again? Honor your father and mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you, right? So, you know, if your parents are not upholding morality, then you're not going to uphold it, and society is going to collapse pretty quickly, right? And that's probably what God is getting at when he gives that reason, so that your days will be long, right? That you may live long in the land that God is going to send you. And so, you know, your parental figures, that's why it's so important, you know, that, well, from the top down perspective, it's all the more reason why parents need to be good parents, right? Because if bad parenting will lead to destruction, right? And once again, the whole absent father epidemic thing, right? And single mother families is like it hurts. It's really sad that that has happened. And of course, you know, when the feminist movement started and all this man hating, right? Of course, it's wrong to just hate men because of that. But at the same time, you can't be so harsh on the women because it's like, well, a lot of them are victims of that kind of thing, and it really does suck. And yeah, the Bible's absolutely right that like without that, those parental figures, the days you will not live long in the land God has sent us to, right? Because then everybody will just be hateful, and we are reaping the fruits of that. Unfortunately, it's just kind of the reality of it. That spider's really bothering me. But anyway, I'm gonna try not be distracted. We're already an hour into the stream, and we're still only in chapter 20. All right, the last five we should speed through pretty quickly. So, do not murder, or you shall not murder. Do not murder. It's pretty. You think it'd be pretty straightforward, right? But it's not as straightforward as we like to think it is, unfortunately, right? But the taking of human lives, and you got to know where I'm going with this. But a society cannot survive if it has no problem with killing other human beings, right? Especially the innocent. Of course, when people think of like the death penalty is a very different thing, right? But of course, the Bible will talk about how murderers get the death penalty, right? Because the logic is, if you take a life, you gave up your right to live, right? Because you denied some. Or let me put it this way: the reason why murderers get the death penalty is because if you disregard someone else's right to life, then your right to life gets disregarded, right? So that's why, murderers get put to the death penalty. But of course, once again, that's you have to understand the definition of murder, right? It's the taking of innocent human life. Innocent, can be in quotations, but like, a person who has not done anything that deserves death, right? Because nobody's perfect in life, and we all do wrong stuff. But you stealing your stapler from work is not warrant of the death of somebody killing you, right? Or a guy says a lewd comment to a woman because some guys can't help themselves, because unfortunately people are like that. But it doesn't warrant the death penalty, right? Even though that's kind of what's happening nowadays. Which is why guys have to be way more careful about stuff they say, right? And I mean, it's not like guys shouldn't be. They should always be careful what they say. But you can't go from 0 to a 150 that fast, okay, right? You don't just dish out, judge, jury, and executioner, right? So when he talks about like murder as taking innocent human life, when we say innocent, we mean like there's a lot of things in life that don't warrant us getting killed, right? Like, sure, I may have hot takes on the internet, or whatever, your coworker does something that's really annoying, right? But there's a lot of those kind of things that you just have to deal with, and they're not worthy of like people deserving to die, right? Like, most of us have a right to life, and just let us live, right? Live and let live, right? Is how the old saying goes. And so the Bible's pretty adamant about that, right? Do not murder. Do not just take people's lives, because, one, God is the giver of life. There's that theological reason, and then the societal reason is all like, well, people can't just go around killing each other, because then society would collapse pretty quickly. You know what else will make society collapse really quickly? Is if people thought with their dicks all the time. Well, guys think with their dicks. I guess women don't. You know what I mean. But like, do not commit adultery, right? Can't go sleeping around, because one, it generates a lot of those. Remember the whole father-mother thing that we were talking about? The big problem that we run into society. Well, adultery plays a big role in that, right? Because people just think, well, You know, funny sidetrack, and we're going to like some people would say 18. We're rated R right now, but there's the diss of calling a guy a dickhead, and the whole joke behind that is that, like, well, a dickhead is an actual part of the human body. It's what the like inch tip part is called. It's called a dickhead, or that's its colloquial name. It does have a scientific name, but I can't remember what it is. But that part of part of the man's penis, right? It's called it's referred to as the dickhead. So it's a natural part of the human body, and people make jokes that guys think with that part, right? It's called thinking below the belt, and so we call those guys dickheads because for that reason, right? You're thinking below, that's the kind of the joke, right? You're thinking below the belt all the time. Um, we call those people dickheads, and so um, in regards to do not commit adultery, it's kind of like you can't be a dickhead, right? Because you got to think of things more important than your satisfaction, which is another thing that's kind of, a societal problem, right? And, if you read Brave New World, it's basically this in a nutshell. I mean, Brave New World refers to other things too, but like people just living with how they feel, right? And as I mentioned before, yes, we have feelings and they're all over the place, and nothing wrong with that in a vacuum. But you can't rely on those feelings to orient how you live, right? Because you're gonna run into all kinds of problems, especially when it comes to stuff like guys that are a bit of a dickhead, right? Understandably so. You can't just think that way all the time. You got to be a responsible human being, right? And it's another reason why the Bible is so adamant on like marriage the way it is. But we'll cover that ground when we get there, because Bible's got a lot to say about that. So we'll cover that when we get there. But adultery in a nutshell, can't be sleeping around, especially when it's like people's like married people. And there's a whole other context to it too, where like marriage was meant to be a more binding thing. And I mean, yeah, some people still believe in it today, but it's not in the same way that people viewed it back then. That's all I'm going to say about that for now. We'll talk more about this. Commandment number 8 is a very annoying commandment in the sense of studying it, not what it says, but like, do not steal. The funny thing about this commandment is that it is the only commandment that is not specific, right? So, worship the Lord your God. It's pretty specific. Um, you know, honor your father and mother, right? Your father and mother are the ones who get honored. Do not murder, taking innocent human life. Two unmarried people cannot commit adultery, right? But do not steal doesn't even begin to describe what the limits are. And the implication is it means you cannot steal anything. And of course, there's the whole thing where one of the biggest, and you can see this problem, where a lot of the laws in the Bible, when we go from like Leviticus especially, we continue on to Deuteronomy, a lot of the laws have to do with the do not steal command, because while it's the most straightforward of what it means, do not steal means you cannot steal anything, the biggest problem that comes with the commandment being so vague and broad is how do you apply this, right? And the different dimensions of which it can be applied, right? Because not all things have equal value. Therefore, not all thefts are the same. Therefore, not all punishments to theft can be the same. And so the Bible goes in great detail on different ways of approaching this commandment, which is, I guess, what happens when you have a commandment as broad as do not steal. And then, of course, the Bible goes back to something super specific in commandment number 9. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor, or as we commonly know it, do not lie. My hot take on when it comes to words, and I was making this joke about like sometimes I sometimes use expletives. There's a lot of things the Bible says we shouldn't say, because you should be a decent human being and love your neighbor and not be a jerk to people. So there's a lot of things we shouldn't say, right? I shouldn't use so many expletives. We should be men shouldn't use lewd comments towards women, right? Women shouldn't gossip so much, those kind of things, right? And there's gossip is a little different. That's not a good example. But like, okay, men should not say lewd things to women, right? You shouldn't use so many expletives in your conversation, right? There's a lot of things we shouldn't do, right? But there's one thing that the Bible says you cannot say, and that's lying. And there's two reasons for this. Well, there's the theological and the sociological reason. The theological reason, when it comes to do not lie, is pretty straightforward. Jesus says, I am truth, right? If God is truth, then lying is antithetical to his nature, right? So I think that's why God says you cannot lie, whereas other things is like you shouldn't do it, but you're not like there's no specific command to say you cannot do this. Whereas in regards to lying, you cannot do it. And I think it's one big reason, well, the main reason really, is that it's antithetical to the nature of God, who is truth. So that's why do not lie is on the 10 Commandments. And whereas other things like, don't speak lewd things to women is more like a suggestion. Not just a suggestion, that's not a good word for it, but it's like, we'll still constitute it as a sin and you shouldn't do it. But at the same time, it's not on the top of the list of things on the laws, right? But lying is definitely up there. And it's because it's antithetical to the nature of God. So there's that. The sociological reason is, once again, a society cannot survive on liars, right? Because you take a Discord community as a good example, right? Where most people kind of just say whatever. But something that cannot be tolerated, at least in all the Discord communities I'm in, is no lying, right? You can't go and spread gossip about people, right? Which is essentially a false testimony against your neighbor. Which is why when I said gossip earlier, I'm like, no, that's incorrect. Gossip is a form of lying. Because it might be an exaggeration of truth, which is also kind of lying. But like a community, there's like no lying, right? Like sure, there are some communities, some people like to have their lewd stuff, and when I hang out in those communities, it's like, okay, fine, you can do that, right? And I'm sure I shake my head in derision when guys say lewd things to women, like, you guys are idiots. But at the same time, it's like, okay, like whatever. That community can still stand, right? Even if guys say lewd things to women, a community can still stand when I make fun of my, a fellow streamer, a buddy of mine. I hang on the stream all the time, and like half of his streams, I'm just throwing like disses at him out of good humor, right? Because it's fun to make fun of him. But lying, unacceptable, right? And in a community, that makes sense, right? Because I can still trust a person who thinks about boobs too much. I can still trust a guy like that, even if he thinks below the belt at times, more often than he should. But I'll tell you who I can't trust. I can't trust a liar, right? I can't trust a person who has contempt for truth, right? And in the same way, a society cannot survive if it has contempt for truth. A society can survive lewd men. A society can survive, people who make fun of each other too much. A society can survive, a bunch of sailors and sailor talk, right? A society can survive all those things, but a society cannot survive liars. A society cannot survive contempt for truth. And that is why do not lie is in the 10 Commandments. And finally, the 10th commandment is about your thoughts. And mainly to the stealing one. Well, I mean, stealing can easily be applied to this one. And there's a funny thing about the do not steal command, because you can apply it to all the other commandments. But commandment number 10, you should not even think about taking stuff that belongs to someone else, right? You should not covet your neighbor, his wife, his slaves, or his stuff, right? You cannot covet, his family. You cannot covet the people that work with him and work for him. You cannot covet his stuff, right? Basically, covet is a word that's used to be more than envy. Like, it's one thing to think like, man, I wish I had your kind of car, right? I wish I had a better paying job, right? But it's another thing to say that, like, man, is like, with how much money you make, you should be able to pay for both of us, right? That's coveting, right? Or something like, man, you're undeserving of your job. I should have your job, right? That's coveting, as opposed to like, well, I kind of wish I had a better job, right? Because there's nothing wrong with that. We should all want better jobs. Like, yeah, my job sucks, right? It's not a sin for me to say like, I wish I had a better job, right? It's another thing for me to be like, man, I'm more deserving than this other person at my workplace. Um, and so I should have that job, not you, right? That's a way of understanding the difference between coveting and envy. So yeah, that's the 10 Commandments. And that's just the 10 Commandments. We're still in chapter 20 and now we're already like an hour and 15 minutes. See, like between the hour and 15 minutes now and the 1 hour and a half yesterday, then basically we did like a whole stream on the 10 Commandments. So let's talk more about this text. When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain and smoke, they trembled in fear, stayed at a distance, and said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen, but we will not have God speak to us, or we will die." So, I mean, I don't really need to talk about this passage too much. I mean, I already did in great length already, right? When God is being all terrifying and grim reaper-like, I guess, the Israelites are like rightfully scared, and they should be, right? Because this God isn't just some dude, right? This is God we're dealing with. This is the guy who brought the 10 plagues on Egypt. This is the guy who divided the Red Sea. This is the guy that creates pillars of fire that like walk around, right? Unnaturally. Like this is God we're talking about, not just some Joe Blow. So yeah, the people of Israel are pretty terrified of God, and that's something else that a lot of people downplay about who God is. So yeah, God is, if he is, the maker of the universe, if he is all powerful, all knowing, yeah, it's a terrifying thought. And you should never neglect that, because people who don't have the fear of God, in both its respect and its like phobia is not the best word for it, but like know your place, right? Then us people who don't have the book of Proverbs 1 basically says the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, right? And so know your place, and that's kind of where the Israelites are kind of like, whoa, like they're rightfully scared, but at the same time I was like, God said in the 10 Commandments that he's our friend, right? And so there's this interesting contrast here, and this is where the weird imagery, like I think this is where the Bible's so rich, right? When you actually dive into like the imagery and understanding that imagery, right? But despite the fact that God is like all terrifying with the whole dark cloud of darkness and whatever, right? That he still reaches his hand out to us as a friend, and it's something that like in the human mind seems like so bizarre, right? But I think God intended that, and that might be part of how we understand taking a leap of faith, right? Because yeah, it is meant to be scary, but at the same time, you read through the Bible, doing what's right, being obedient to God, it's never easy, right? And just like this encounter with Israel, it's not easy, right? It is terrifying, it is scary, and it's easy to apply that in our lives today as Christians, right? Like yeah, like being faithful to God, it ain't easy, right? You know, confessing that we believe, it ain't easy, and it never was, and it was never meant to be easy. If you think confessing your faith as a Christian is easy, you're doing something wrong. But the fact of the matter is like no, it's terrifying, and it's difficult, right? And that's how it always has been. And I think that's kind of what the scene and the imagery here kind of paints, right? To be a follower of God, it isn't easy, even like in regards to our relationship with God Himself, right? And that's why I think there is meant to be this kind of almost conflicting imagery that's played here, right? He is our friend, but he's also like this he's also extremely terrifying. And so I think that's a really interesting image that's used here. Just finishing off here in chapter 20, we finally made it to the end. He talks about building an altar. If you are to build an altar for God, just use don't craft it, right? And the idea is that, you don't try and imagine what I'm like. This is who I am, right? And that's another whole, the I am who I am thing, right? God is not limited to the human craft and the human imagination. And so God's just like, if you have to build an altar, just use stones or whatever to burn the offering on. So it's not even an image of God in a rock. That's not what he's getting at all. But it's just the idea that if you have to make sacrifices, just use what you have, right? You don't have to make a new craft, right? Because I am beyond your human imagination. It's basically what God's getting at here. And of course, there's that awkward ending where it's do not make an altar on steps, or it'll expose someone's privates. And so the idea is that you think of a ziggurat or a pyramid, right? Pyramid's not a good example. A ziggurat's a little bit better. If you don't know what a ziggurat is basically, well, it's like a pyramid, but you think of those movies, right, where it looks like a pyramid, and that's why it's easy to get them confused. And on a ziggurat, the altar's on the top of a pyramid, right? A pyramid serves a little bit of a different function. On a ziggurat, there's an altar on the top of it, and people walk up to that altar, do their sacrifice or whatever, right? And so God's do not build me a ziggurat, and for obvious reasons, right? Have dignity among yourselves, right? Because especially when people are wearing skirts or whatever in the ancient world, because when you're in the Middle East, it's hot as hell over there. So people aren't wearing full pants in the Middle East because it's hella hot over there. You'd be sweating like crazy. People wore skirts and shorts and whatever, right? And if you got short shorts or whatever, and you're walking up a ziggurat, and people are gonna be able to see down there, right? If they're below you on the steps. So God's don't embarrass yourselves, right? And I think that's kind of what God's getting at here. It's one thing that I mentioned this before with the whole hardening of Pharaoh's heart. You don't need to over spiritualize stuff that the Bible says. The Bible's pretty clear on what it means, and you just have to use a bit of logic too, because God built the Bible with an internal logic in it, and if anything, God gives us too much credit to be able to logically think things through. So, here's another passage that don't over spiritualize it. God is just saying, don't build me a ziggurat kind of thing. Don't embarrass yourselves, right? It's embarrassing if you actually see a dude's privates as you walk up the stairs. You look stupid, so don't do it. That's the main reason why God gave this command. And there's no other explanation, so it's a simple, Occam's razor, right? The simplest explanation that requires the least amount of assumptions is usually the right one. So Occam's razor wins out here. All right, whew, boy. And we're already halfway through the stream, and we're only in we just finished chapter 20. But don't worry, that's the longest part of this. Chapter 21. So these are the laws that you are to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free, without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him children, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, but only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master, and my wife and children, and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost, and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she will not go free as male servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her go and be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to a foreigner, because he has broken faith with her. If he selects for her his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these three things, she is to go free without any payment of money. That one is full of hot takes. Anyways, verse 12. Anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. However, if it is not done intentionally, but God let it happen, they are to flee to a place I will designate. But if anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, that person is to be taken from my altar and put to death. And anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. If people quarrel and one person hits another with a stone or with their fist, and the victim does not die, but is confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held liable if the other can get up and walk around outside with a staff. However, the guilty party must pay the injured person for any lost time and see that the victim is completely healed. Anyone who beats up their male or female servant with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined, whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is a serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and bruise for bruise. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. If a bull gores a man or woman to death, the bull is to be stoned, and its meat shall not be eaten, but the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. If, however, the bull has had the habit of goring, and the owner has been warned, but has not kept it penned up, and it kills somebody, the bull is to be stoned, and the owner must also be put to death. However, if payment is demanded, the owner may redeem his life by the payment of whatever is demanded. This law also applies if the bull gores a son or daughter. If the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master or the slave. The master of the slave, and the bull is to be stoned to death. If anyone uncovers a pit or digs one and fails to cover it up, and an ox or donkey falls into it, the one who opened the pit must pay the owner for the loss and take the dead animal in exchange. If anyone's bull injures someone else's bull and it dies, the two parties are to sell the live one and divide the money and the dead animal equally. However, if it was known that the bull had the habit of goring, yet the owner did not pen it up, the owner must pay animal for animal and take the dead animal in exchange. So, chapter 21. This one is full of hot takes. So let's do this thing. So, chapter 21. The first part is about the servant thing, right? If you have a servant, and if you have a Hebrew servant, he works a certain amount of time, then he can go free. And then, of course, there's the whole, arranged marriage thing, which is actually what the whole female servant thing is. And, you can do arranged marriages with a servant. So basically, in a weird way, if you have the idea was that if you had a female slave, right, you were kind of like a parent. And in ancient cultures, parents, arrange marriages for their kids. I mean, that's still a practice today in some countries, like in India. So, that's a thing. And so, that is what the Bible's referring to. Now, I know that when people read this passage, a lot of people talk about how the Bible condones slavery, right? Because there's this whole thing about if you have a slave and whatever, and if you hit them and he doesn't die, then you don't get punished, which sounds ridiculous, right? And so a lot of people said, like, well, the Bible condones slavery and even abuse. But one of the biggest problems that when people misunderstand the Bible, and it goes back to chapter 20, the second part that I kind of skimmed over, where what happens when people are too afraid to actually reach out to God, even when God is terrifying? Well, God is going to compromise, which sounds weird, right? Because you wouldn't think that God would compromise, his own integrity. You wouldn't think that. But, God allows people to play by their rules because God is a nice guy in that way. And so God does not disregard that people are going to be abusive to each other. And God does not say that, well, if you abuse anyone, you're going to be put to death. Because once again, we get to the whole do not murder command. And yeah, some people are pretty bad, but there's very few things that we could do that would actually rightly constitute like the death penalty, right? And so God is trying to work around this. And if anything, when people say, well, the Bible condones slavery, it's like, no. The bigger problem, if you want to call it that, is that God is too nice to humans. That's the real problem here, if you think about it. If you read, and you continue on in chapter 21, which we'll get to, the real problem, if you wanted to make a case for one, instead of saying that the Bible condones slavery, because that's not accurate, as we will read later on how we are to treat people, but rather the real problem would be that God is too nice to people, and he actually does not just put people to death instantly for being abusive, right? So, God doesn't go like, oh, you called your neighbor an asshole, so you should be put to death, right? God doesn't do that. And so when it comes, I mean, that's kind of a small example and not the best one. It's not a one-to-one, but when it comes to like when people treat each other like people in slavery and how people own each other as slaves and servants. And of course, one of the big problems in language is that there weren't two words for different kinds of slave and servant. It's just kind of like, let me put it this way. The modern idea of like slaves were like, as North Americans, we immediately think of like cotton fields, right? And stuff like that. And it's ironic that we're talking about this in February, right? Because it is Black History Month. But, that concept of like just kidnapping people and making them work on your cotton farm, that wasn't the idea that was around. Well, actually, that was an idea. That's what the Egyptians more or less did. But it was, once again, a little bit different, even how Egyptians did it. And they were viewed as the bad guys. So, I mean, yes, what happened in recent history is way worse. But at the same time, you cannot use that imagery to talk about something when that wasn't a thing back then, if that makes sense. So what is the Bible then talking about when it talks about slaves and servants and using the same word for them? So many people refer to indentured servitude. This is not the best way of looking at it, though. That is, once again, a more later idea, especially with the Romans. Well, the Greeks came up with it, but you get the point. So here, the idea was that, now see, when I word it this way, it's going to sound way worse now, but it can't be helped. In the ancient world, in the way that people were divided up, and, tribes, and especially land ownership, in the ancient world, it was very few owned, and everyone else just lived on the land, right? So in a weird way, back then they had the whole 99 and the 1% thing. It's just the way it is, right? So you had landowners, and they owned a lot of land. But to be fair, I mean, in the ancient world, a lot of land, wasn't that much compared to what we would call a lot of land today. And secondly, because places were smaller in the ancient world, in the sense of like, you can't build a metropolis like in New York. Things weren't like that back then. for obvious reasons, technology. But basically, it was a 1% and a 99% kind of thing in the ancient world. And before people get all like antsy about like, oh, they should have redistributed the wealth or whatever, which doesn't make sense realistically. Hot take of the week, right? So anyway, like I said, there can be a lot of hot takes. But with that whole like 1%, 99%, what the Bible's getting at is, look, you're gonna have this 1%, 99% problem. Can't be helped, right? Without God directly saying like, nope, nobody gets anything. You all do what I say, right? Which God could have taken that approach, but he doesn't, because he's too nice to people, honestly. If anything, he's too nice to people. As opposed to many people's arguments that God is mean in the Bible. And if anything, he's guilty of being too nice to people. But basically, God is saying this whole 1%, 99% thing, unless I directly change it, it's going to stick that way. But instead of directly changing it, because I don't want to force my hand, because God is being a nice guy, he's saying, okay, 1%, this is how you ought to act. All right, you better not be like the Egyptians or worse, right? As we will encounter those people later in the Bible. You better not be like that. So this is how you should treat the other 99%, right? The people that are going to live on your land. And that is what the Bible talks about with servants and slaves, right? Because basically, if only 1% actually owns anything, as similar to the world today, and the 99% of us were all slaves, if that makes sense. That's kind of the best parallel I have. So basically, when it talks about servants and stuff like that, the Bible is really referring that everybody is more or less the servant role, because remember, that's how you have 99% and a 1%, right? So what the Bible is getting at when it talks about like, okay, now with that being said, you know, the 99% got to live somewhere, because, you know, the 1% can't say you can't live here. That's ridiculous, right? And so with that said, now you're going to have all these people living on someone else's property. Now you have to deal with how they're going to live together, and of course in relation to, you know, the owner. And so people cannot beat each other. The way people marry each other, slaves and servants or whatever, marry each other, whatever, right? And people move around in rotation, because that's how society would work. You can't stay at one place forever. You know, that's where these kind of laws come in. Now people were to conduct themselves. And so there's this weird passage, a lot of people go, huh? Where it's like a man goes into a place, right? And he works for 6 years. And then he, if the master gives him a wife and she gives him like kids, then the women and the children stay with the master and the man can go free. Now that's a pretty weird passage, right? But once again, you have to understand the whole 99%, 1% thing, where it's like, no, she lives here. If you're moving out, too bad, right? Because they live here, they stay here. If you want to move out, then you move out on your own. And so it's one of those tough things, and you know, we see that in the world today with like, you know, once again, it's the 99-1% thing, and you know, yes, it's not a great system in the grand scheme of things, but at the same time, it's like, well, it is what it is. And so most of these laws, when it comes to the servant thing, talks about the dynamic of a 1% and a 99%, as opposed to the idea that, oh, the Bible condones slavery, which is not necessarily true, because, you know, you're going to run into all these passages where God says, well, you better treat slaves nicely and all that, or you will be punished by God. So how can, you know, you think of it logically, right? How can the Bible condone slavery and then also say you will be put to death for hitting a slave? But of course, this is where a very interesting passage comes in, and it's the passage I do want to talk about. And it's the famous eye for an eye. So we'll start from verse 22, which has a very weird beginning. If you are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there's no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is a serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, and so on. It's a very weird passage, right? Because on the one hand, you cannot actually deal equal damage or inflict pain equally, on two people, right? So if you take out someone's eye, there's no way you can really uh, equate the pain, right? Even if you took out the other guy's eye. So what is the Bible actually getting at when it talks about this eye for eye thing? Now, the interesting thing about this passage, and it is explained a little bit in more detail when it comes to the bull goring people, which is a hilarious set of laws, by the way. It's like if a bull gores a guy, then like you pay money. But if the bull is known for stabbing things or goring things, like always ramming its horns, that's what that means. Um, and the owner does nothing, then the owner is held liable, right? And stuff like that. So, and you have to also understand this other weird passage about hitting a pregnant woman, because it sounds ridiculous that a guy would hit a pregnant woman, but people are assholes, right? So the Bible is talking about something very interesting when it does the eye for an eye. And so when it talks about the serious injury, what do you think the Bible's talking about? It's not talking about the woman at this point. It's talking about the child, right? That the woman is pregnant with. And when it talks about a serious injury, it's referring to a miscarriage. But of course, that language didn't exist back then. The word miscarriage wasn't a thing in the Bible because no one used that. That wasn't a real word back then, right? So when the Bible says, "Oh, and there's a serious injury," it refers to like, what if the woman had a miscarriage because you accidentally hit her, or whatever. And then it does the whole eye for an eye. What the Bible is oddly doing here is trying to equate all human life, which sounds antithetical, if you were in the camp saying that the Bible condones slavery, when you read the earlier part of the chapter about how to have slaves. But here, when it talks about the eye for an eye, it's saying that all human life is equal, right? And that's what that means, life for a life, eye for an eye. Because another thing you need to consider is how the ancient world used to work. And this is not just true in the Middle East, but you can think of feudal Japan. You can think of, ancient China. Even not, when I say ancient, it actually goes up to like pretty recent. Um, and even still exists in communist China, oddly enough. So, oddly, the idea that the Bible is trying to debunk still exists in the world today in communist countries. Major hot take, please don't strike me. But the idea was that not all people believe, and some people believe to this day, and we call those people disgusting and bigots, that people believe not all life are equal, right? So a bad example of that, okay, like let's take communist China, because we're gonna make fun of them. Please don't strike me, internet. But like the dictators are viewed as like gods, right? So the idea is that like their eye is worth more than like the average person, right? The average person has no real stock, and that's why the economy doesn't exist the way it does over there, like it does in America. In America, money is money, right? Whether how much you make is based on what you can contribute to your economy, right? If you make good enough products or you do good enough work, right? And so, but that's more on you as an individual working, right? As opposed to like inherently, use this example. I have low amount of viewers because I'm an Asian Christian male. I'm at the bottom of the tier list of what is attractive, right? Why lie about it? Racism is a good place to kind of poke fun at this, right? Where some people view other people groups as being less than, right? And so, why do you think we have stuff like Black History Month and fighting against the idea that like people used to think that the life of a black person was worth less than that of a white person, right? Which was an idea that was shut down, part of the whole civil rights movement that, Martin Luther King Jr. fought for, right? And champions of history like him, right? And of course, you go even further back in time, you think of feudal Japan, right? Um, shogun, or not shoguns, but like the emperor was viewed as a god, and so, you know, the caste system of like the samurai, their lives were not expendable, right? You don't treat them as cannon fodder because they were more valuable than other people. And so, um, the nobility, they were viewed in high regard. And so, if let's say a lower caste person accidentally, poked the eye of a noble, he could be put to death. Now, once again, I kind of made this joke illustration back with the do not murder command. But like, you know, if you called your neighbor an asshole, that's not warranted of somebody having the right to kill you, right? And that's a very Christian idea or biblical idea. Christianity didn't come up with it. It's older than Christianity. But, it's a biblical idea that like, okay, I called you an asshole, but that doesn't give you the right to kill me because me calling you an asshole isn't enough of a crime, right? I shouldn't call you that, but at the same time, it doesn't warrant you killing me, right? Or, someone bumps your car while you're driving. Yeah, it's expensive and it costs money if somebody, you know, bumped your car, but you don't get out of the car and start beating the hell out of the guy, right? Like, you don't do that, right? They're not equal crimes, right? And so, when the Bible's talking about, life for a life, eye for an eye, it's trying to establish that all human life is valuable. So when we go to the miscarriage, that's the Bible's implying here, but the Bible has no word for it back then. If a woman had a miscarriage, then you got a real problem here, right? And so the Bible implies that the guy should be put to death. That's what the Bible implies here, right? Because what it's saying is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? Bruise for bruise, burn for burn. The baby that was miscarriage has all the same things and is of equal value to the offender in this case, the person who hit the pregnant woman. Doesn't matter who it is. And so the interesting thing when you look at this text and really try and understand the nuances is that like that's what the Bible's actually getting at. So going back to does the Bible condone slavery, as it has this whole thing on slaves in the first part of chapter 21, the Bible later says, well, not in the sense that you abuse people, but rather how there will always be 99% and 1%. You cannot change that, not by human means anyways. But regardless of that, despite the fact that that will always be a thing, and it still exists today, obviously, as we are having a war about it, basically, kind of. But like, the 99 1% thing, it just cannot be helped. But despite that, all human beings have equal value as people, right? And that's why eye for an eye is a thing, and why that's important. And of course, what the Bible also gets at is that this is a thing about human life. So the miscarriage baby and the offender, presumably an adult man, is what the Bible implies. And of course, ancient societies, adult men were the real citizens, and everyone else was kind of like lower tier of the citizen thing because ancient cultures are like that. The patriarchy. Um, but that doesn't matter. Is what the Bible is getting at. Is no, all human life is equal. If a woman has a miscarriage because of you, guess what? You're liable. And since the baby is a person, it's a life, and you killed it, it falls under the do not murder. And you know what happens to murderers? The death penalty. And so that's what the Bible is implying. And so when it says eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, what it's really saying is that your eye equals the eye of the eye of that baby is equal to your eye, even though you've seen a lot of life. The tooth of a baby never bit anything yet. Hell, the baby hasn't even sucked, the mother's teat yet. But yet that tooth has equal value. Hand for hand. The baby has not touched anything yet. Not really, right? You may have used your hands for a lot of work. baby has equal value, right? And this applies to human life, which is where chapter 21 has the odd ending of the whole bull thing, because a bull is not a human, right? And so the bull has different consequences, and humans can be held liable to it, right? And this is where the whole Bible does that weird ass thing where it's like, okay, if the bull just gores someone by accident, then you pay money. But if the bull is known for doing this and the owner does nothing, he's held liable because it is his mind that doesn't, his negligence or whatever, his disregard for his fellow citizen that could be attacked by his bull. You know, he is held liable, and then therefore it's a human to human thing, and you go back to the eye for an eye thing, right? And so it it chapter 21, though it's a strange approach, it's trying to establish that all human beings are the same, even though there is the inevitable circumstance of there's going to be a 1% who owns everything and a 99% of us that don't. And so how should we operate as a society, and how do we maintain human dignity despite the fact that's going to be a thing? And the funny thing is that's more relevant now than it was back then in a lot of ways, right? Because as I implied, there's kind of this subtle war going on amongst North Americans. We're basically having a civil war in a sense of like the 99% versus the 1%, the people who have too much versus the people who have not, right? And so the Bible acknowledges, yeah, this is going to be a problem forever as long as human beings are, well, human beings. But we are still to regard each other's humanity regardless of that, right? Which is why the laws are so bizarre, right? Because it's like, well, you still have to treat each other like people, despite the fact that, yeah, you're going to do things that you don't like to do because that's the way things are, right? And to take it on a dark note, you think of like people that are forced into the sex work industry, right? It sucks, right? And those people are basically, they make, they're forced to dehumanize themselves for work. It's terrible. But, you know, you all the more reason to fight against stuff like, human trafficking is because no, those are people that are shoved into these positions. And so the fact that, some pimp may disregard their humanity, it is our obligation as moral human beings to to uphold their humanity, right? Stuff like that. Humanity it's a very delicate thing, right? And how God cares about it, as said in the Ten Commandments, as I explained. God cares about us as people. That's why he made the Ten Commandments the way he did. And then, of course, when we get into these nuances of like the way things are is not good, right? The world is a pretty broken place. I mean, duh, right? But you still have to try and be moral people, even in the face of that. And it ain't easy, right? I mean, here we are, over 3,000 years after, the book of Exodus, and the 99 and the 1% thing still exist. It's still here, right? But that doesn't change that, like, even though something like that may not change as long as human beings are around, we still ought to hold each other in high esteem and with dignity, right? Because, God demands that we are good to each other, right? From a human to human, right? And so in another way, the Bible is also debunking this idea of like economic status equals personhood, right? Because the whole owning of slaves is talking about like, well, there are people with the money to do that, right? They hold the land, they own stuff, they have that power to have slaves. But that doesn't change that human beings are all valuable, right? Another part of the whole, humans made in the image of God, right? We all are extremely valuable despite the fact that, yes, economics may make things not look that way, but that's all the more reason that, we have to rely on how God defines us, made in his image, right? because that is how we will guide. That's how we can be guided to live morally. And so that's what chapter 21 is getting. Chapter 22. Oh, this is a fun one. And I think we're going to end with chapter 22. Because, first of all, that spider's kind of freaking me out now that it's kind of moving. Though very slowly. And, secondly, I already did a whole babble on, like, chapters 20 and 21. So maybe chapter 22. We'll see if we can do chapter 23. But I kind of feel like chapter 22 is going to take a while. So here we go. And I am getting a little bit tired, oddly enough. Long day. Chapter 22. Whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it must pay back 5 head of the cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. So basically you have to pay a multiplier if you steal someone else's stuff, right? Basically interest. And a lot of it, from the looks of it, which, well, anyway, sorry, I'm going to read the chapter first. I shouldn't do the commentary yet. Okay, whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. If a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. It's an odd rule, but okay. Anyone who steals must certainly make restitution, but if they have nothing, they must be sold to pay for their theft. If the stolen animal is found alive in their possession, whether ox or donkey, they must pay back double. If anyone grazes their livestock in a field or vineyard and lets them stray, and they graze in someone else's field, the offender must make restitution from the best of their own field or vineyard. If a fire breaks out and spreads into thorn bushes so that it burns stalks of grain or standing grain or the whole field, the one who started the fire must make restitution. So, no arson. If anyone gives a neighbor silver or gold or goods for safekeeping, and then they are stolen from the neighbor's house, the thief, if caught, must pay back double. But if the thief is not found, the owner of the house must appear before the judges, and they must determine whether the owner of the house has laid hands on the other person's property. In all cases of illegal possession of an ox, a donkey, a sheep, garment, or any lost property, about whichever somebody says, "This is mine," both parties are to bring their cases before the judges. The one whom the judges declare guilty must pay back double to the other. If anyone gives a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any other animal to their neighbor for safekeeping, and it dies or is injured or is taken away while nobody is looking, it's an odd exception there, the issue between them will be settled by the taking of an oath before the Lord that the neighbor did not lay hands on the other person's property. The owner is to accept this, and no restitution is required. But if the animal was stolen from the neighbor, restitution must be made to the owner. If it was torn to pieces by a wild animal, the neighbor shall bring in the remains as evidence and shall not be required to pay for the torn animal. If anyone borrows an animal from their neighbor and it is injured or dies while the owner is not present, they must make restitution. But if the owner is with the animal, the borrower will not have to pay. If the animal was hired, the money paid for the hire covers the loss. If a man seduces a virgin, wow, totally different shift there. If a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price and she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must still pay the bride price for virgins. You shall not let sorcerers live. Anyone who has sexual relations with an animal is to be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed. I love that wording. Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. and charge no interest. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset, because the cloak is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? When they cry out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. Do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people. Do not hold back offerings from your granaries or your vats. You must give me the firstborn of your sons. Do the same with your cattle and your sheep. Let them stay with their mothers for 7 days, but give them to me unto the 8th day. You are to be my holy people, so do not eat the meat of an animal torn by wild beasts. Throw it away to the dogs. So, yeah, chapter 22 is one of those. Oh yeah, remember when like the Bible says do not steal, and it's like super vague? Well, here is one example of like, okay, how do we actually apply this law? So chapter 22 starts with this whole like, okay, so if you steal something that belongs to someone, then you have to pay like 4 or 5 times as much, right? Which I guess is an incentive. Don't steal, because there's going to be some heavy consequences. But we can't kill you for it, because stealing is not, you know, a crime that is warranted the death penalty, right? So, but we're still going to try and find ways to incentivize you not to do it. So let's make them pay a lot. But then, of course, somebody will be like, well, what if this is a poor person, right? They can't pay that much. Well, the poor person, then, we'll treat them like we're going to force them into really shitty slave work. You know, the job nobody wants to do, right? You know, those crappy minimum wage jobs? Well, maybe we'll make them do that, right? And they'll be forced to work back what they stole. Which, it ain't easy, right? Because, you know, if a person is willing to steal, they might steal from their employers, and then that will cause other problems. But once again, you know, the law will be like they'll just up the sentence, right? So there's obviously a workaround. And then of course there's the livestock thing. So like if your animal, you know, grazes on someone else's property, you know, keep stuff on your own property, right? You can't use the excuse of like, well, my animal is not as smart as me, so if it eats something on your property, well, tough. It's like, no, right? You as the owner have a responsibility. And so the Bible is basically saying like, no, you have to take responsibility of like what happens on your property. And so the animals thing is kind of used as the illustration, right? Because, you know, people, you know, the Israelites were shepherds, a large number of them. So that would make sense to use that illustration. If you want a different version of how to understand, you know, the whole you're responsible for what happens on your property. I don't know how it is. Well, it depends on where you live, right? I mean, I know this definitely happens in like other parts of Canada, but in Canada, if it snows, you're required to make sure your like the sidewalk and the walkway to your house, you are required to make sure it's shoveled up clean when it snows. And the reason for that is because let's say someone is walking on the sidewalk by your house and you didn't put away the snow, and the person falls over because walking in snow ain't easy, right? So the person falls over and they hurt themselves. You can be sued for that, which sounds ridiculous, right? Like you might say, well, that person should have, you know, been more careful when walking by my house. But that argument cannot be used if you didn't shovel. And so the person who got hurt has the right to sue you, as crazy as that sounds, because Canada's a crazy place, right? So the idea here is that you are responsible for your property, right? And your property cannot be a problem for someone else, right? And so that's what the Bible was kind of hinting at here with the whole like if your animal goes on someone else's property, right? Because the animal is your property, so you're responsible for what it does. And of course, animals are a little bit more tricky, right? Like a sidewalk doesn't move, right? But an animal does. So this is another reason, like, okay, here's a more easy example, right? Why, like, if any of you own a dog and you walk your dog and your dog poops on someone's lawn, like, you are supposed to pick up after your dog because, your dog is your property. And so you're you're accountable and you're responsible for what your dog does, right? Even though you can say, well, my dog can't help itself, it just needs to go poop, right? But if it poops on someone else's, property, um, you know, you got a problem, and the person has a right to sue you if you don't clean up, especially if they catch you in the act. I mean, that's the main way they can make the accusation anyway. They have the right to sue you. Oh, my dad is calling. Give me a second. I better take this. Anyway, my dad was just checking on something because we have to do some business stuff, sorting money around. It's not fun. Adulting. Anyway, where was I going with this? Oh, yes. So the whole being responsible for your property thing, right? Funny because we're moving money around. We gotta be responsible for it, right? And so, and it's funny that we're talking about these do not steal laws, right? Where you have to be smart with, if someone lends you something, and there's some of those other laws there about, let's say someone owns you their animal, or they leave it in your care and you don't properly manage it, you can be held liable, right? And that's one of the big struggles about, well, money management, relevancy. Um, but money manage, the property management that the Bible talks about is like, you ought to treat it seriously, right? Especially if someone lends you something, right? Because you can't act as if like you can do whatever you want, right? And you and other people have to learn to live together. Back to the whole 99 1% thing, and why, you know, one person may own the property, but everyone else has to live on it, right? And so, excuse me, you have to be responsible with what you have on that property. And so that's why, like, the animals and the slaves thing is relevant too, right? Because you as the individual are responsible to make sure that, like, okay, we're good stewards and we take care of the property we're on. Another example of this is like, um, okay, so you think of like a Starbucks coffee shop, right? So the building belongs to a real estate company because real estate, but then Starbucks rents it out, and then Starbucks has to like follow certain rules that the real estate sets up, right? And Starbucks has to be like, okay, so we pay a certain amount for rent, and we have to make sure places like doing its thing. Starbucks has to serve coffee because that's what we are, right? And all that. We have to make sure no illegal activity happens here. Stuff like that. Starbucks has responsibilities, right? And then of course within that you have the all the employees, right? And of course there's the system within that, right? Like your site manager and supervisors, and of course the employees. And there's a certain set of rules they have to follow in regards to how they respect Starbucks, and then by extension respect the real estate company that owns the space. And so I don't know, I just thought of that illustration. And of course a funny story comes to mind where um, there used to be this Vietnamese restaurant across the street from my house. Well, not across the street directly, but like if you cross the main street and then just go down the road a bit, there's this Vietnamese restaurant, and it was like a front for gangs. Because you would hear gunshots, no joke. You would hear gunshots like almost every few nights. and because gang activity, right? And then eventually the place got shut down, and now it's something else. I don't remember what it is now. I think it's like a hair. No, it's a Brazilian restaurant now. I think it's a Brazilian restaurant or something like that. But anyway, besides the point. But you know how to how to deal with property, right? And it ain't easy, and of course you have obligations when you work on someone else's property or whatever, right? Because technically the real 1% is all the real estate agencies that own every place that we do work on, right? And so that's always fun. But anyway, I'm getting off track. Let's just finish this chapter. Um, Going on the commentary here. So animals. Anyone pays a neighbor for safekeeping. Basically, yeah, you better if someone lends you something for safekeeping, you better be responsible, right? So this is an interesting passage because I talked about the whole 1%, 99% thing, which is obviously the whole slave thing or servant thing in chapter 21. And of course now the chapter 22 talks to the 99% and about how okay, like you are to be responsible even though like you're the have-nots, but that's not a good way of wording it because it's not like the 99% were all beggars or something. That's terrible, right? Because I mean, like think about it this way, like okay, most of us are the 99%, right? And we are living relatively fine, right? So the 99% of us, we have obligations, right? Like the easy ones are like in regards to where you work, you know, you don't treat the property badly, you don't, you do your job, and you protect your business's interest, right? Or your employer's interest because that's part of your job, right? And so the protection of property that the Bible talks about in chapter 22 is kind of just a very early version of that, a primitive version of that, if you will, of the idea that like, okay, if you're going to be working, you as the 99% are going to be working on the 1%'s property. You can't be like, well, it's unfair that you have all the wealth and I don't. Instead, we should be responsible people, and I will still protect your interests. And so you have no right to covet them. So commandment number 10 is brought up. And of course, don't steal from other people and cause trouble for, your fellow man. So commandment number 8. So that's basically chapter 22 in a nutshell, at least the first half. Because the second half takes a total tone shift, right? Because starting from verse 16, there's the whole, if a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, or what we commonly refer to as the dowry. And she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give him to her, or give her to him, wow, dyslexia, he must still pay the bride price for virgins. Um, yeah, so this is where, like, yes, we have kind of evolved from simple, like, shotgun weddings idea, which is basically what this is, right? It's a shotgun wedding. Um, and the idea is to discourage, like, oh, one, guys just sleeping around, because then if you force him to get married, it's like, all right, you better just have her as your wife and your only sexual partner, because once again, there's the whole family unit thing that needs to be considered, because back then, um, you know, protected sex was not common, if existent, in the ancient world, right? Which means more than likely there's going to be a pregnancy occurring, which means you're going to have a kid. There's going to be a kid running around, and you don't want that kid to have no real family, right? Or no parents to call his own, if you will, their own, because this can apply to daughters too, obviously, right? Um, but with when the Bible's talking about like if a guy has sex with a girl and they're not married, the guy should just marry her, right? and pay the dowry, right? Just kind of, I guess you're doing the consummation before the ceremony, which is, I mean, one way of doing things, but it's not a great one. But it's trying to, similar to the whole stealing thing, you know, you're trying to find ways to incentivize not doing that, right? You're trying to incentivize people not to steal, and in, you know, verse 16, you're trying to incentivize people not to sleep around because that's bad for your society. What the Bible's getting at here is like, okay, like, once again, God is being too nice, if anything, right? And so he doesn't just say like, oh, put him to death, right? No sex before marriage, you shall die, right? Like, God doesn't do that, right? He's too nice, man, right? If God were to commit any real crime here, it would be that he's too nice, right? Because, you know, most of us would be like, nah, man, that dude should be shot, right? Most of us would think that, right? And rightfully so, right? Because guys who do that are assholes. But that's not warrant of the death penalty. Remember that, just because someone's an asshole does not warrant the death penalty. And, you know, the Bible's completely conscious of this. But what the Bible is trying to say is that, like, look, I can't stop you from doing that. But if a guy seduces a virgin, you know, I'll let you have a workaround. You're allowed to marry her after consummation, all right? I'll let you have that, okay? I'm not going to be so mean as to just smite you there and then, okay? Right? So God is being really merciful here, if anything. However, you know, God has some other not so nice things, right? Because he's like, okay, those things, you know, it can't be helped. But there are other things that are really problematic, and it's really bad for your society if you allow this, right? Because the whole, like, if a guy seduces a virgin and then you shotgun wedding, you know, you can maybe patch up the problem. But there's some things that you know, it's really bad for your society. So maybe you shouldn't let these people live. And so, like, sorcerers, which is like a broad term, people usually think of like magic, right? Because usually, you know, you play a video game that a spellcaster class is like a sorcerer class or whatever, right? But that's not exactly what the Bible talks about when it says like you shall not let a sorceress live. The odd implication that was used when it comes to stuff like witchcraft and sorcery and whatever, there was this belief in the ancient world, and it's not Bible exclusive, so it's not like the Bible is the only people who harp on this, but it's the idea that like there were people, mostly women, as the tales go, right? Wherever we're just basing this off on like ancient world legends, no real facts to base this off. But anyway, so a sorceress or a witch or whatever, there were people who would commune with like the demonic world, right? And they would use that to gain power. But demons being demons, and as perverse as they are, according to legend, is that the price that a witch or sorceress would have to pay in order to get these special powers would be to have sex with the demon. That's basically kind of how the myth goes, right? And so, because these women defile themselves by having sex with these monsters, basically, that's a big no-no, right? Sex should only be between, well, human beings. That's why if a man seduces a virgin, there's a workaround, right? The Bible's like, okay, we can make a workaround if a man seduces a virgin, right? It's still people with people, even though yes, we don't, you know, we prefer, you know, sex to be within the confines of marriage. We can make a workaround with, you know, two young people, right? After all, two unmarried people cannot commit adultery, right? All right, we can make a workaround with that one. But then the Bible mentions the whole sorceress thing and why they cannot live. And it's kind of this idea of like people having sex with other species, which is funny that the Bible brings up the bestiality thing next, right? And so when you understand those things kind of together, then it's like, oh yeah, this makes total sense. One, that's really messed up to be screwing things that, you know, for humans to be screwing things that are not other humans, as weird as that sounds. But work with me here. So the Bible says your society cannot survive if people are not having sex with other human beings, right? because, well, there's the whole procreation thing, and even for recreational sex, that some couples do. Um, at least that has its place, right? But there's no place for interspecies, intercourse and other things. You know what I'm getting at. This is where, like, once again, you know, we shouldn't say lewd things, but the Bible would then contradict itself if it said that you cannot say it, because the Bible is clearly implying some kind of lewd things here, because the Bible knows what people think, okay? Like, the Bible knows euphemisms well enough, okay? And it's using them here. So that's what the Bible actually means when it says, do not let a sorceress live, right? And it's the idea of, it's not so much of like people who cast magic spells, right? Like in, you know, the common interpretation. But of course, if you understand mythology and, legends about like, people with magic, and this is why the idea of like magic is so shunned upon, is because the belief is that a lot of people who use magic usually, the idea of selling your soul, and more than that, right? You sell your body, and at least according to these legends, you sell your body to like demonic forces, which is like a big no-no, right? And so that's what the Bible's actually getting. And it makes sense when you read the next couple passages, right? Because then it also brings up bestiality, right? Anyone who has sexual relations with an animal must be put to death. And so the idea is that, like, no screwing non-humans, right? And I mean, understandable. Yeah, your society is going to collapse if, people were going around having sex with whatever. One, there's cleanliness issues. Like, let's be real. Like, let me ask the ladies. I know this sounds like a really messed up question, and yes, I'm going there, so you got to deal with it. But ladies, for real, would you want to have sex with a guy who was like having sex with a horse like the day prior? Like, hell no, right? Like, you wouldn't, and that's completely logical. And so this is where, like, the Bible is like, this is why bestiality is not okay, right? Like, your society would not survive. Because think of it this way, like, from a logical sense, let's take out the spiritual stuff for a minute, right? Let's think of it in a logical sense, right? Like, okay, if guys were going around having sex with animals, or, I mean, you could easily argue this vice versa, but let's just use this illustration, right? If guys were going around having sex with animals, no woman would want to have sex ever again, right? And if no woman would ever want to have sex ever again, that's the end of the human race, right? Because then no sex, no babies, no procreation of human beings, no more humans to keep existing, therefore extinction, right? So humanity would not survive, right? And at the same time, you'd be understanding. It's like, yeah, no woman would want to have sex with a guy who's screwing animals, right? So that's why bestiality, big no-no, right? And for completely logical reasons, right? I don't even have to bring up the quote unquote that it's a sin argument. I mean, logic itself dictates that it's a bad idea. So let's just go with that, okay? I mean, it's sensible enough for me. So, continuing on, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. So going back to the whole, does the Bible condone slavery and beating your slaves? It's like, no, right? You are not to oppress anyone because you were once oppressed. And so God is using this whole argument of like, human beings are to be treated with dignity. Remember when you were treated, indecently by other human beings and how bad that was? You better not do it, or you will be, I will mistreat you. And then God even has one of the best lines right after the whole foreigner thing. He talks about the widow and the fatherless, or the orphan, right? And he says, do not take advantage of them. If you do and they cry out to me, I will hear their cry. My anger will be aroused and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows and your children fatherless. And so God takes this whole, like, you better treat other human beings really well, especially those who are, already at a disadvantage in life, like widows and children, right? They're not as independent as, adult males as would be in the ancient world. And so God's saying, if you treat them badly, I will personally deal with it, which is the last thing you ever want to hear from God, right? Is like, I will personally deal with you is not something you ever want to hear, right? But God makes this very big. But when God says it that way, He's making it a very big deal, right? Which once again, it brings up that God is this. Really, he's a he's he's more nice than he should be, right? But I mean, that's part of why we say that God is good, right? That he's way too good, really, um, because that's part of him being in his, that he is good in nature, right? And that he is the source of goodness. Is that he's, for lack of better words, he's too nice, right? He's way too nice, and he's way nicer than he should be. At the same time, I'm going to be grateful that he's way too nice because, we're all sinners and we all deserve, to be punished. But, thank God that that he's way too nice because I kind of like not being punished. How about that? And so, I mean, that's that's all the more reason we are to be thankful for who God is and, his goodness because he easily does not have to be. And let's just finish off about, well, there's really not much else. There's the whole system of the consecration that's kind of brought up in the last couple of verses. So in the last part of verse 29 says, "You must give me your firstborn of your sons. Do the same with your animals. Let them stay with their mothers for 7 days and give them to me on the eighth day." And then he continues on saying, "You are to be my holy people. So don't eat animals. Do not eat meat torn by wild beasts." And so this idea of the consecration comes up. And this is one of the big problems and another reason why people skip over these chapters. One, they're difficult to explain and study. And secondly, they're kind of disjointed, right? Because God's just kind of giving a whole bunch of edicts, right? And of course, Jewish scholars with like the Mishnah and the Talmud, which are much later writings, you should give them a read. They try to expound on these passages because God just throws a lot at the people, right? Because I mean, there's a lot of edicts that you need to do. I mean, especially if you want to run a society, you're gonna need a lot of rules, right? I mean, if you think of it this way, like a game like chess or something, or even a simpler game, checkers. Well, I don't know if that's a simpler game. They're both pretty complex. But like you think of a board game like chess or checkers, right? And they have a set of rules, right? And all those rules must be followed for the game to work. And then you want to bring that up, right? Because chess or checkers only have 2 players. Now imagine a board game that has 4 to 6 players, like Settlers of Catan, right? So Settlers of Catan has even more complex rules because it involves more people. And you have to have you have even more rules, and they all have their nuances, right? So Settlers Catan, you build your properties, whatever. You have a win condition, but you have to play fair. You can even trade with people, even with the idea of like getting yourself ahead. But at the same time, you have to be smart about how to make it look like the other guy's benefiting, even though you're trying to get ahead. Stuff like that, like Settlers of Catan. And that's only 4 to 6 players. And then you got to bring it up to like a basketball game. It's 10 players. Well, actually, it has more than that because reserve players, right? Because the same 10 guys don't play the whole game, right? So a basketball game has like a whole bunch of guys, right? And let's get an even bigger game, right? Or the big sports, right? You think of like football. We just had the Super Bowl. Well, wow, it's weird to think that Super Bowl was like 5 days ago. We just had the Super Bowl, right? Football is a massive game, and it has so many rules and nuances. It has way more rules than like a game of chess or checkers, right? But of course, football has to have more rules because it's a big game. It has a lot of players. Now, I use games as an analogy because it makes sense, right? Because you think of any game, it has its set of rules and they need to be followed, or else the game can't be played, right? Because when you're a little kid and you're playing like a board game that has 4 players, like Snakes and Ladders, right? You know what pisses off kids? Kids who try to cheat and not play by the game's rules, and they try to make up their own rules, right? And it pisses off all the other kids, and then the other kids don't want to play with that kid, right? But you know that the the level of gameplay, as the game gets bigger and has more people, then the level of gameplay goes up, and then more rules are added and are needed, right? And you can apply this to life in general, right? So life has a set of rules, right? And life is the ultimate game, right? Because everybody's a player. So it, the game of life, if you will, directly or indirectly, in your perspective, is that you're a participant. Wow, I can't talk. You're a participant in an over 7 billion person game, right? And so when you look at the Bible, and when people say, "Oh my gosh, the Bible has so many rules," and they're kind of disjointed and they're all over the place, as we just read only like 3 chapters, and we got a whole bunch more to go. Yeah, the later part of Exodus. There's a reason why people like to skip over it, but at the same time, you cannot be ignorant of the fact that there are so many rules, right? Because if you're playing in the game of life is massive, right? You're a participant in an over 7 billion person game. Hell, the game can even be considered larger than that, right? You're playing in the biggest game. And I skipped so many steps because you could think of like, okay, within like your community. So I'll use a church community as an example. Your church community is a game that you are a participant of, like, well, it depends how big your church is, right? If you're in a smaller church like me, you have about 50 some odd people, 50 to 80 people in your church. So you're 1 out of 80, just to highball it, right? That's a big game, right? And if you have an 80-person game, you have a lot of rules, a lot more rules than a football game actually has about 80 people. So you have about as many rules as a football game in a church community. Or, an even bigger game, you think of like a school, right? You go to university and there's like a couple thousand of you there, right? And you all have to play by the same set of rules. And so the university has to have way more rules than, say, a church community, because there's that many of you playing, right? And you can just keep upping the ante, and where I skip to the game of life, right? That's why life has so many rules, right? And you have to treat the Bible as like part of the rule set of the game of life, right? And that's why the Bible goes in detail with so many different rules, because the Bible is kind of playing at that meta game, right? That you're a participant in a game that involves the entire human race. And of course, that's why there's all this morality and how we treat each other in these Bible rules, right? And in the game, and you think of like the game of life, like real life, not the board game of life. Um, you know what I mean? There, all the more reason that you need all these rules, and all these rules have nuances within them, right? Because that's how big the game is, and you have to respect that, right? And then, of course, if you were to put God as a participant in the game as well, right? Who is the ultimate person you have to play against, in a sense, right? And play with, then of course, all the more reason to really pay attention to the many laws that the Bible lays out, right? Because you're playing in the game of life, and God is also a participant in it, as weird as that sounds, right? But at the same time, you should be very conscious about how you approach that dynamic, right? You're in the game of life with God, right? And that's a big deal. That's a very huge deal. I mean, that's the most important thing in your life, really, right? If you think about it hard enough. And so you better pay attention to the rules, right, of the game. Unfortunately, I mean, the thing that bothers a lot of us is that, man, this game is way too many rules, right? But at the same time, the game of life would not be the game of life without them. And that's just something we have to deal with. And all the more reason we need to understand what the Bible teaches in regards to the laws, right? Because you're going to be playing this game of life for who knows how long, right? You better know the game. You better know it, right? But once again, God's a really nice guy. He lays it out for you. He lays out what the conditions are to win and lose. And, you know, we're grateful that God is so merciful to, like, he just shows the full hand, right? All these game metaphors. I love it. But serious talk, though, right? Like, you cannot disregard, like, you know, the laws that the Bible lays down. Even though, yeah, it's tempting to kind of skip over it when you read the book of Exodus. Oh, man, there's all these rules, and they're kind of all over the place, and they're hard to understand. And, yeah, that's true. Anyone who says otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about. The laws are not easy to understand, but at the same time, they're important for playing the most important game you will ever play, right? The game of life with God. But at the same time, you're not alone in it, right? And, you know, the gospel moment, I guess you could say, is that, like, one of the most beautiful things about, like, understanding the scriptures, and, you know, as you read through the entirety of the Bible, is that, like, yes, playing the game of life with God is so intimidating. I mean, he's God, right? But at the same time, this is all the more reason God took on human flesh, and as he plays the game with us in the game of life, as God plays it with us and takes on all the challenges of those rules, even though we may not get all of them, because, you know, there's only so much your brain and my brain can wrap its head around. But Christ came and embraced all those rules for us in the game of life, and will guide us every single step of the way, even when we make mistakes in that. Because we're not perfect, and we don't know the game of life perfectly. It's just how it is. But Christ came and embraced all those rules for us, and played the game fully for us. In the person of Jesus Christ. And so you don't have to feel so intimidated like the ancient Israelites did. They were like, oh my God, this is so scary, right? To play this game. And, you know, there's that easy temptation to think that I don't want to play if the game is going to be this hard. But Christ came down so that it would be possible for all of us. Anyway, that's like, I have this odd feeling that, like, because there's so many of these chapters that, like, has to go over all these different rules of the game of life, if you will. That's what I'm going to call this now. I mean, that's basically what the book of the law is, if you think about it, you know, hard enough. Or if you just think of it in a weird dimension like I do. But that's besides the point. There's going to be a lot of other, like, future streams will basically be me expounding on these, and I know this can sound boring at times, but, you know, I hope you guys stay faithful and, you know, one, trust God, and two, hopefully, you know, come back to my stream next week. Just going to do some housekeeping, and then we'll end the stream here. If you have any questions, just put them out, and maybe I'll get to them. But I am getting a little tired, so we'll end the stream pretty soon. So next week, I mean, for the next couple of weeks, it's going to be pretty straightforward, right? So I know it's Lunar New Year today, so happy Lunar New Year. We're in the year of the ox now, so moo. For moo streams, next Monday, depending if I get back or not, I should be able to. I managed to do it just fine last week. I was home at like 1 last week, so you know, 2 hours is more than enough to get ready for Monday's stream. So it's just 3 houses, man, till Friday. So Monday to Thursday, 3 houses. I'm gonna try and get that game done. And then after that, it will be, excuse me. Next Friday, we'll continue from chapter 23, which is more laws. There's like so many. Oh, so many. I'm just looking. It's like, I might read like 5 chapters next week, and it's all about like priestly ordinances and laws. So strap yourselves in for next week's reading stream, because that one's gonna be a doozy. But anyway, this is gonna. So that's basically the housekeeping. 3 houses for 4 days, and then Bible reading on the next Friday. And then hopefully I'll have 3 houses done in 8 streams, because there's something I really want to do. If you haven't guessed it yet, you know, I mean, I'm gonna make you keep guessing, but it should be obvious what I actually want to do. I have mentioned it before, of something that I'm kind of excited to do, and I want to stream it while it's fresh, if you will. So there's your other hint if you don't know what I'm talking about yet, if you haven't figured it out somehow. But I'm gonna try and have 3 houses done in like the next 8 streams, basically, that I do it. Might not be doable, we'll see. It's gonna be pretty tricky because like I still have like 10 chapters in the game. And then, you know, 2 Fridays we're gonna be doing a lot more of like Exodus and all these laws. From chapter 23 to like, I think the laws end at like chapter 30 something. Because there's like a break in it, and then God does more laws. It's kind of, yeah, it's a lot. It's like 10 chapters of laws, and then like there's a break, and then more laws. You gotta bear with me, okay? Like, I'm doing this to help you guys too. So, with that being said, this is gonna be the end of the stream. Thank you guys for coming, hanging out, and hearing me expound on these very wordy laws. There's a lot to go on here, but, you know, meditate on it. If you have questions, you know, you can always ask me, you know, on Discord. And of course, there'll be next week's stream. You can even ask me during the 3 houses streams, even, if you have like questions about like what I read today and stuff like that. But anyway, this is gonna be the end. Hope you guys enjoyed. Leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you guys next week. You guys have a great day. Have a great weekend. Happy Lunar New Year. Happy Valentine's Day. And God bless you.